the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry. Before I introduce today's guest, I do want to mention that I do have a Patreon page at www.patreon.com/MUHH. If you're enjoying the content I'm putting out, please do feel free to throw us a little something to support the podcast. But I'm extremely excited today because we have today's guest, Dr. Saul Newman. We've read numerous articles of his on the podcast, and I'm just I'm tremendously excited. I'm a little bit nervous, Saul, and I've done about 130 of these, so it's not often that I get nervous, but this is big for me. So thanks so much for joining me.
I hope I don't disappoint you.
Not at all. I don't think that'll happen. I was already a big fan of yours, but I picked up. So I had finished Post Anarchism the other day, and then I picked up the Bakunin and Lacan book. And your section on Lacan, I was kind of sitting there with my roommate, kind of giggling out loud. He's like, "Yeah, what's going on?" I'm reading past it.
I got it all from Zizek, actually. So I probably got sort of rather a jaded interpretation of Lacan. So I subsequently actually went back and read some Lacan after writing it. Found it was actually quite different from.
Oh, really? Interesting. Okay.
Anyway, but that was my PhD thesis. That was a long time ago.
But before we get into the meat of today's discussion, I actually wanted to read a quote, a bit of dialogue from George R.R. Martin's A Clash of Kings from the A Song of Ice and Fire series that I thought just fit, I think, the overall kind of theme of this episode really well. Power is a curious thing, my lord. Perchance you have considered the riddle I posed that day in the inn. It has crossed my mind a time or two, Tyrion admitted. The king, the priest, the rich man, who lives and who dies, who will the swordsman obey? It's a riddle without an answer, or rather too many answers. All depends on the man with the sword. And yet he is no one, Varus said. He has neither crown, nor gold, nor favor of the gods, only a piece of pointed steel. That piece of steel is the power of life and death. Just so, yet if it is the swordsman who rule us in truth, why do we pretend our kings hold the power? Why should a strong man with the sword ever obey a child king like Joffrey or a wine-sodden oaf like his father? Because these child kings and drunken oafs can call other strong men with swords. Then these other swordsmen have the true power, or do they? Varus smiled. Some say knowledge is power. Some tell us that all power comes from the gods. Others say it derives from law. Yet that day on the steps of Baelor Sept, our godly high septon and the lawful queen regent and your ever so knowledgeable servant were as powerless as any cobbler or cooper in the crowd. Who truly killed Eddard Stark, do you think? Joffrey, who gave the command? Sir Ilan Payne, who swung the sword? Or another? Tyrion cocked his head sideways. Did you mean to answer your damned riddle, or only to make my headache worse? Varus smiled. Here then, power resides where men believe it resides, no more and no less.
That's wonderful. It actually reminds me of Etienne de Lavoisier's famous thesis on voluntary servitude, actually, where he argues that in a way power is an illusion. It's something which is constituted by our voluntary obedience. In other words, power is created by our kind of belief in this kind of illusory idea that someone actually has the power over us. But when you really break it down, that power entirely rests upon our own sort of voluntary subjection or voluntary servitude to something which doesn't even exist. So yes, I think actually that quote is quite reflective of the powerlessness of power. And of course, Stirner would argue that I think there's a quote in the Ego where he says that the powerful are only powerful because we are on our knees. Let us rise.
It's a great quote. How did you first encounter Stirner? I'm kind of curious. And I'll give you a little bit of context. So now, I don't know, how familiar you are with sort of online culture and whatnot, but amongst the left, amongst the kind of theory or philosophy crowd, Stirner is kind of a meme. So that's actually how I first uncovered him, just through seeing random memes of Stirner, and then it kind of like piqued my interest, and I sort of dug in.
And a fan club on Facebook, which I've just joined recently, actually.
Oh, nice.
Produced a series of rather amusing memes. It's called Post Anarchism, actually. Yes, exactly. I mean, Stirner's a figure who's really not taken all that seriously within sort of most philosophical circles, actually. If you say you're into Stirner, people kind of regard you as a bit of an oddball. And Stirner himself, for a long time has been very much on the margins of philosophy, very much a neglected figure. There's very little literature, very little scholarship, at least in the English language, on Stirner. So he's really not, he's really regarded as kind of like a black sheep, really. But in a way, that kind of his kind of marginality is what makes him interesting.
Very true.
He's someone who really takes a wrecking ball to the entire history of Western philosophy and says it's all bullshit. It's all based on a series of quasi-religious abstractions, and really his kind of philosophical project is to really demolish the sort of the history of Western philosophy and rebuild it from the ground up, actually, which is his project is extreme. It's one of the most sort of radical thinkers I've ever encountered, which is kind of what makes him appealing to me. That little book, the only book he ever really wrote, well, the only book he's known for is really it's a nuclear bomb held in the hands of the most sort of unassuming, meek and obscure character who, spent his better years teaching at a girls' school, died in complete poverty, and really a kind of a non-entity, actually. Although, having said that, he was one of the key figures of the young Hegelian circle, which is a very sort of influential group of philosophers and journalists, including Bruno Bauer. Karl Marx himself, of course, was very much influenced by these thinkers and intellectuals, and so Stirner actually, I think, had in some ways quite a big impact on sort of subsequent thinking, including, of course, on Marx himself. The German ideology
right.
is a kind of two-thirds of it is basically a repudiation of Stirner, whom they call Saint Max. Of course, but there is an argument that in a way Stirner was actually quite instrumental in this notion of the kind of the epistemological break in Marx's thought between this kind of early humanism and this kind of later, more as it were, sort of scientific approach to historical materialism and so on. So Stirner had this kind of subterranean influence, I think, in subsequent sort of philosophy and theory, I would say.
How did you even encounter his work? Because I'm sure, assuming this is probably early internet time, so I don't know how.
Very much so, yes. This takes me. I was writing my PhD thesis, so we're going back to sort of 1994 to 98, and so the PhD thesis, which was the From Bakunin to Lacan book, was an attempt to kind of rethink anarchism through post-structuralist thought. And I felt that I'd kind of reached a certain sort of impasse. I was trying to kind of put these two sets of ideas together. So,
right.
19th-century Russian anarchism, Bakunin, Kropotkin, on the one hand, Proudhon to some extent, of course, with 20th century post-structuralist thinkers like Foucault, Daredev, Lacan, Deleuze, and Guattari. So I was kind of looking for that missing link. So is there a thinker which kind of brings these two traditions together? And I just almost by accident stumbled upon Max Stirner's book in a public library. The Ego and its it was the old, a much older sort of. It was still a Stephen Byington translation, but I just don't remember the old sort of like pirated cover with this kind of cartoon picture of Stirner on the. It was before the Cambridge version came out. So I picked it up, and I was in a public library, so I was just fascinated. I just started reading it. I said, this is my guy. I found missing links.
That's perfect.
Philosophical gold dust here,
Right.
So I kind of read the book in space about 2 days and so on. And it was really a sort of eureka moment. And so I came to the conclusion, actually, that in a way Stirner was this kind of sort of early postmodernist, early post-structuralist. So he's engaging in this sort of critique of Hegelian idealism, of humanism, of the liberal state, of essentialist concepts and so on, which he regards as being sort of philosophical and a kind of a hangover from religion and from Christianity. And I could just immediately see the connection with kind of with this sort of critique of meta-narratives, which you would find in 20th century post-structuralist figures. So in a way, Stirner became this kind of sort of pivotal point in the argument of the kind of the theoretical trajectory of the thesis, the PhD thesis. And I suppose you could say that since that time I've been kind of fascinated by Stirner ever since, So there was a moment of discovery. Yeah,
that's amazing. How would you say? I think maybe one of the most important things we should point out or discuss about Stirner is, and you do this quite well, is kind of making the distinguishing line between liberal individualism and what Stirner has in mind when he's referring to egoism.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of confusion around this, actually. I mean, Stirner's notion of the ego is often conflated and confused with, either kind of the liberal individual or some kind of, libertarian, Ayn Randian idea of the, sort of selfish individualism or possessive individualism, for instance. And it's just a total confusion, actually. I mean, I think one only simply has to read Stirner to see that the notion of the ego, der Einzige, or perhaps better translated as the owner, is much more radical notion, and it simply cannot be reduced in any sense to the liberal individual. Why? Because it's a figure which Stirner described as a kind of a creative nothingness. In other words, it is without essential properties. So if you compare this to the kind of the model of liberal individualism, which is about I guess sort of being a kind of a rational chooser, being a utility maximizer, right, being self-interested, being endowed with certain rights, being someone who has the capacity to own property and so on. Also being a kind of a citizen of the state, which kind of ties in to some extent with kind of the figure of the liberal individual. I mean, Stirner kind of completely dislodges and demolishes all of his concepts. I mean, firstly, he's completely against the idea that property and property rights can be in any sense secured and protected. So the egoist is someone who, in a way, kind of absorbs the entire world into his or her own concept of property. So the entire world becomes the property of the egoist. Now, what that means, in a way, is that the whole notion of property as a kind of a institution which can be protected through law, as in my notion of, or as in the notion of private property, becomes completely unstable. And of course, the whole idea of being a kind of a creative nothingness suggests that the egoist is a figure which is always in flux. In other words, it's not a fixed identity as such. It can't be sort of confined within a kind of a sort of set of concepts or ideas or essential properties. It's something which is always changing. It's much more, I think, to do with, for instance, Deleuze's notion of becoming. It's a movement, it's a flux, it's something which is always being kind of created and recreated and reconstituted. It's a kind of an anarchic figure of the subject. I mean, I think probably the thinker the contemporary thinker who perhaps comes closest to Stirner in this regard is Giorgio Agamben and his notion of singularities, or whatever singularity. You're perhaps familiar with, with Agamben's philosophy. But once again, the singularity is a figure who simply cannot be defined in any sort of stable way or through any sort of stable identity. So, I mean, to me, on my reading anyway, and of course this is contested, but I mean, I would say that Stirner's figure is really quite antithetical to the notion of the liberal individual.
In the book, you discuss, in the Bakunin to Lacan book, you discuss war as Stirner's model of relations. which I thought was an interesting take.
Yeah.
And how much was that influenced by kind of Deleuze and like the war machine concept, or am I
Yes,
just taking that at face value?
Yes, I mean, I think, see, Stirner's tricky because on one reading, he sounds a little bit almost a little bit like Hobbes, actually, the state of nature, the war of every man against every man, where he talks about, the power politics. In fact, he even mentions the war of all against all. So there is, I think, some notion Stirner's thinking of a kind of almost a sort of an antagonism or potential antagonism between egoists, simply because, egoists are, in a way, affirming their own power. On the other hand, I don't think this actually, in any sense, rules out or militates against, the ideas of love, unity, solidarity, even collective action, for instance. But I think Stirner would say that, in a way, everything is based upon this kind of very paradoxical figure of the egoist who may well find him or herself in a relationship of a certain kind of hostility or potential hostility with other egos. But once again, perhaps not. I mean, other kinds of relations are possible, and it really is up to the sort of egoist to kind of constitute those relations with others. I mean, you have to understand what Stirner is against is any kind of, as it were, sort of universal moral obligation which society or religion or sort of morality itself kind of imposes upon the individual. It's not that he's against morality or ethics as such, but he believes that it's up to the egoist in a way to kind of affirm his or her own ethics or determine his or her own sort of ethical or moral disposition. Simply because he believes that all of these kinds of grand narratives are ideological distractions. They don't really exist. And to be made concrete, to be made real, they have to be brought down to the level of the egoist, which for him is the only reality. I mean, it is really the only thing that's real in this world. So people like you and me, individuals, define our own reality, our own worlds. It's up to us to do it. It's not up to God or to the church or to other forms of moral authority to kind of define morality for us. It's up to us. And I mean, who else can it be up to, really?
And that goes to the sort of war on essentialism that you touched on a bit. I'm curious. I can't remember if I had this idea first or if I gleaned it just from reading you, or what the order was there. But I saw, I don't know how would you compare Stirner and Derrida in terms of their overall project? It feels like they're either parallel or they're getting at sort of a lot of the same things.
Yes, it's complicated. I mean, so in Spectres of Marx, of course, Derrida talks about Stirner. He talks about Stirner as being the kind of the sort of twin brother of Marx. So both figures are sort of engaged in this hunt for spectres, ghosts, the ghosts of philosophical idealism, for instance. I mean, Derrida is quite interesting because he's one of the few kind of major continental philosophers or sort of post-structuralists to actually in a way take Stirner seriously. Deleuze also talks a little bit about Stirner in relation to Nietzsche, of course, but yes, I mean, Derrida actually regards Stirner as actually having potentially quite a big influence on the trajectory of Marx's thought, and in a way kind of uses Stirner to sort of in a way deconstruct Marx himself. Actually, I suppose you could say that both Stirner and Derrida are engaged in a certain kind of project of deconstruction, deconstruction of the philosophical tradition. And of course, deconstruction is not a destruction as such, but it is an attempt to kind of, question, break down essentialist assumptions and sort of the key foundations of philosophical thought, to question everything. So I think that's where these two thinkers would come together to some extent, actually.
Right.
Yes. I think that's probably what they have in common here, actually.
I think destabilizing the center, or which I think for Stirner, is the state or the spooks, what have you.
Yes.
But you mentioned briefly Nietzsche, and so I'm curious as well to get your sort of take on the differences, because there's a ton of overlap, I think, in But there are some distinctions to be made.
There are, indeed. I mean, it's a vexed question, I think. I mean, and there is some debate about the extent to which Stirner might have influenced Nietzsche. There's been a few books on this, actually. A very old one by Albert Levy, I think, on just called Stirner and Nietzsche in French. There's not much evidence, I think, to suggest that Nietzsche was, or the degree to which he might have been influenced by Stirner, or even whether or not he actually read Stirner or was familiar with his thinking. I mean, I suspect he probably was.
Right.
But the two thinkers, while they might have, I think, some sort of superficial similarities, I think they're quite different. I mean, I regard Nietzsche to some extent as quite a reactionary thinker. I think because he had this kind of nostalgia for hierarchies, for elites, for some, for some kind of aristocracy, actually. And even if that might become an aristocracy of spirit or an aristocracy of culture rather than, the actual nobility as such. I mean, I think in a way it's kind of modeled upon, a kind of a sort of fundamentally sort of anti-egalitarianism or anti-egalitarian kind of sensibility, if you like. And it is modeled on a certain sort of notion of sort of aristocracy and nobility. And of course, his Nietzsche's hostility to democracy, to equality, to socialism, and I mean, to say nothing of his absolute hatred of anarchism, which he regarded as a kind of a philosophy of ressentiment. I mean, I've actually written about this actually. Referred to the anarchist dogs who are kind of roaming the streets of European culture. Whereas I think Stirner is actually, I mean, even though some anarchists quite divided actually about Stirner actually, but I think Stirner is a thinker who's probably much more hospitable to anarchism, and certainly sort of there's a tradition of anarcho-individualism which which Stirner is kind of regarded as a sort of key influence behind. So I don't think Stirner shares any of Nietzsche's nostalgia for kind of hierarchy, whether it's cultural hierarchy or kind of the social hierarchy, which is not to say that he's necessarily a fan of democracy or kind of socialist ideas of equality either, actually. But I think he's probably kind of equally skeptical of both. But if you look at his notion of egoism, it's not a kind of a sort of a hierarchical concept. I mean, he doesn't sort of set up any sort of class of egoists who are apparently superior to non-egoists. Right. He's not in any sense creating or setting up a kind of a kind of a moral or spiritual ideal to be followed. He's not prescribing egoism. He simply says it's up to you. It's your choice. Right. In a way, I suppose he would also say that we're all, whether we acknowledge it or not, we're all basically egoistic at some level. So even when we engage in sort of egoistic or seemingly altruistic actions and so on, we're still doing it at some level from sort of egoistic impulses, which simply means that we're kind of in doing so we're affirming the self. So yeah, but the point is that there's no as it were inequality between egoists. It's simply up to the individual self to kind of realize his or her own inner egoism, if you like.
I think this is a Stirner quote that ties into this, is that idea of, what does he say? Something along the lines of, they are egoists that do not wish to be egoists.
Yes, exactly.
Really gets at that, the nugget.
It's been like what Marx says about the proletariat being, sort of going from being a sort of class in itself to a class for itself, actually. So it's a kind of transition, isn't it, from this kind of, sort of latent, sort of unacknowledged egoism to a sort of, full-blown affirmative, conscious egoism, I think. But yeah, I mean, once again, he's not setting up any kind of moral ideal. He's not saying that we should be like this or we should be like that. And I think that's where a lot of people get Stirner quite wrong, actually. A lot of people sort of accuse him of being somewhat inconsistent in the sense that on the one hand he's rejecting essences, but on the other hand critics claim that he's setting up a new kind of essence or a new sort of ideal, but he really isn't, actually. I think he's simply saying that this is what we can be if we choose to be so, and it's really up to us.
I'm curious to get your take, and you touch on this in the book a bit, is this idea of Stirner and anti-dialectics. And just to sort of ground you a little bit, and there's kind of this division between either, I guess, my own interests. And so I have some listeners are more on the kind of like Marxist Hegelian side of things. And then there's a certain amount of like the anarchists and post-structuralists, and then, accelerationists and what have you. So I'm not my reading is primarily been in the post-structuralist lens. So I'm not as familiar with Hegel and dialectics and dialectical thinking, although it is something that I'm certainly interested, at least just to kind of understand the concepts so I can discuss them, right? So I'm very curious what you mean by anti-dialectics in this sense. And I think you can even there's a quote, if I can find it. Let's see, it was a Deleuze quote. Deleuze sees Stirner as the dialectician who reveals nihilism as the truth of the dialectic.
Yes.
It's a denial of difference and plurality.
Yes. So, if you look at the structure of Hegel's dialectic, you have this kind of sort of contradiction between a thesis and antithesis, but it resolves into a synthesis, into a new kind of dialectical unity, and it kind of dissolves again and divides. I think the point of Stirner's critique of Hegel and the Hegelian dialectic is that it's a fundamentally kind of theological or religious concept. It's based on a certain kind of idealism. So Hegel talks about this notion of spirit, or Geist, world spirit, which kind of derives from Christianity, very much part of Hegel's kind of Lutheranism, if you like, and which kind of worked through several stages of world history, for instance, becoming in a way embodied within the notion of kind of rationality. So the Christian spirit becomes a kind of a rational spirit, which kind of which becomes a spirit of world history, if you like, and historical progress. But it ultimately, in a way, resolves itself into the liberal bourgeois state. In other words, the liberal bourgeois state becomes sort of the embodiment of this sort of ideal, or this notion of Geist or spirit. And I think this is really what Stirner objects to. So he would say that this is simply evidence of the fact that our modern political institutions, namely the liberal bourgeois state, are basically the sort of the hangover or the legacy of Christian thinking, of theology, and Stirner, being a kind of anarchist, is obviously opposed to the state. He says the state and I are enemies. The ego is the ultimate enemy of the state, for instance. And the state, he would say, is based upon a series of religious illusions, and we can see this very much in sort of Hegel's notion of this kind of dialectical unfolding or dialectical resolution, whereby the spirit becomes embodied within the structures of the state, and within the kind of the modern notion of rationality or reason. And I think the figure of the egoist is not, I wouldn't necessarily regard it as being nihilistic in a way, but it is in a way a kind of a breakdown of the dialectic. I mean, because the ego is a figure which is which cannot be fixed at any particular point. The ego can never be, as it were, resolved or brought into a kind of a dialectical unity. I mean, in a way, the figure of the egoist is a kind of a singularity which simply cannot be universalized in the sense that Hegel might imagine. So this is why I think Stirner is a kind of is even though the structure of his argument is kind of dialectical. I mean, he talks about the ancients and the moderns and so on, and he seems to suggest, or rather the structure of his argument suggests in a way the egoist is kind of the dialectical resolution to this process. In a way, the egoist is such a kind of an unstable figure that it's not a resolution at all. It's simply kind of this sort of ongoing void, or rather sort of empty void. This, he calls it a creative nothing. This kind of it's basically kind of a nothingness which cannot take any sort of stable form. So it's kind of in a way his dialectical, Stirner's sort of the structure of Stirner's dialectical argument is very much paradoxical, and in some ways it's all, I suppose you could say, it's a sort of a satire or a satirical take on Hegel's dialectic. And I think what he really wants to show is that, if there is an end to this process, it isn't the liberal bourgeois state and isn't this kind of, reconciliation of historical forces, and it's certainly not, reason or some kind of ethical community, which Hegel, points to or believes is somehow standing at the end of history. It's this kind of, paradoxical figure of the egoist who's just kind of, smiling back at you, saying, you haven't quite got there yet. There is no end to this process, Smiling sarcastically.
Right.
So,
in looking at Hegel, I think one of the first misconceptions that I had was that Hegel was not someone concerned with sort of consciousness. And I guess the phenomenology sort of makes sense in that regard, but I always thought of Hegel as a more sort of macro thinker. So I am interested in, because there's that sort of link between Lacan and Hegel in terms of at least the contradiction in subjectivity itself. But seems to be, just from Stirner being a young Hegelian, a bit of that focus on consciousness has seeped through just a bit, and I know it's not exactly what Stirner is getting at here. But
I mean, you're right. I mean, all of these sort of left Hegelians, young Hegelians, are obviously, thinking and writing in the sort of the shadows of Hegel, or under the influence of Hegel to some extent, even as they were, rejecting him and criticizing him and trying to kind of radicalize his thought. So Stirner is obviously profoundly influenced by Hegel, but I think you're right in the sense that that Hegel is setting up universal ideals, whereas figures like Stirner are interested in differences, in singularities, in that which cannot be universalized. Because if you try to kind of universalize something, then you destroy its difference. You kind of encompass it within a sort of a false abstraction, a false universality, an artificial ideal which simply denies difference, denies plurality, denies singularity. And for him, that's not is it something which one should avoid. It's something which is basically impossible. You simply can't absorb differences into universalities in this way.
I think the reason I brought this up, I thought it was interesting that that Stirner kind of, and you mentioned this in the book, is talking about the state. You have a great line about the state not repressing desire, but channeling it to itself, and that sort of, and the idea that desire for authority, desire to be ruled, has to be is the object, or is the object of what we should attack.
Yes, I mean, it goes back to this idea of voluntary servitude, which I'm quite quite interested in, actually. So I think it's really one of the the sort of the mysteries of political philosophy, and it's something which we haven't quite answered yet, which is why do we voluntarily obey? Why do we at some level desire to be dominated? Why do we desire authority? Why do we turn to fascism? Something which Deleuze was also quite interested in, actually. I think there's a line in The Ego and its Own where he says, every Prussian carries a gendarme in his breast pocket. So authority is something which people often desire. There is this, love of the master. Wilhelm Reich, in his Mass Psychology of Fascism, was also grappling with the same kind of problem. Why do people turn to the fascists in the 1930s? What kinds of motivations did they have? Why did they actually come to desire their own servitude, their own domination? So Stirner, believes that, in a way, the state as a institution of power and authority wouldn't be possible without our own, without our obedience to it. It just simply wouldn't be able to function. And once again, it's kind of an illusion which is constituted by our obedience to it. And I suppose we have to, register the fact that power just simply wouldn't operate and wouldn't function without our complicity. So yes, I mean the state works by channeling our desire towards it, by making us want it, but making us think that we need it, that we need it to govern our lives and to manage social relations and so on.
We certainly see this, and this has particularly resonance right now in the context of the police.
Yes, absolutely.
Arm of the state.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, we're watching these events in the United States with absolute fascination and a great deal of satisfaction and happiness and joy, actually, which I think is a certain kind of break with voluntary servitude to some extent. I mean, obviously, there's a kind of a division, I suppose, between sort of peaceful protests and insurrections and so on. But I think it's actually a very significant moment, actually, that people are kind of turning against the police. I mean, they're kind of redirecting their desire elsewhere. They're calling for the abolition of the police, actually, which is very. I mean, for me, it's a very kind of interesting moment. I think in U.S. history and U.S. politics.
You mentioned insurrection, which is
absolutely
which Stirner advocates over revolution, or as opposed to revolution.
Yes,
and I love this. This is a kind of a paraphrase from the book. Is insurrection is about becoming what one is not, an anarchism of subjectivity, which I thought was just a fantastic idea.
Yes, I mean, there's a great quote where he distinguishes between the revolution and the insurrection, and he says that the revolution is about creating a new kind of society, a new kind of establishment. For instance, it's based on a series of sort of moral ideals. So it's an act of power. It's an act of what I suppose you might call sort of constituting power, right? So you have a revolution against existing institutions, but you just simply create new institutions or a new kind of established in place of the old one. Whereas insurrection, as Stirner says, leads us to never letting ourselves be arranged, but to arrange ourselves. I think that's more or less the quote. So in a way, the insurrection is something which starts from the self, and it's about, in a way, the ego is kind of affirming him or herself, and through that act of, as it were, self-affirmation or this sort of, this sort of release from voluntary servitude, all institutions simply just sort of crumble into the dust. So I suppose, I mean, I don't think he's necessarily opposed to the notion of revolution as such, but I think he would say that, all revolutions start with the insurrection first. And the insurrection is the reclaiming of the self by the self. Right.
That's great.
Reclaiming of this kind of alienated self, which we project onto political institutions, or we project onto, sort of moral ideals and so on, or to abstractions. We kind of, we sort of reabsorb it, we reclaim it back into the self, and everything kind of springs from that kind of one moment. So it's kind of a micro-politics, isn't it? So the insurrection is kind of a micro-politics, and it's micro-ethics. It's a release from our own sort of self-domination. It's the affirmation of our own freedom, our own autonomy. And whatever political consequences spring from that is, in a way, almost secondary to this kind of initial reclamation of the self. So, yeah, I mean, I think the insurrection is actually a very interesting idea. I mean, it's very much kind of an ethic. It's an ethics. It's an ethical act before it becomes a political act.
Oh, that's fantastic. So as we promised, we sort of want to transition to Lacan a bit, but I think this very interesting notion that the through line that connects Stirner and Lacan is perhaps this idea. So, like we mentioned, Stirner has the idea of the creative nothing. And Lacan has the lack as the heart of, or what really kind of defines subjectivity. And I think that's an interesting way to connect those two thinkers, because it's rejecting that sort of rejecting essences. So when you get on the surface, it kind of, how did these two fit together? But when you really look into it, at least at that little line of rejecting that essence at the heart of the subject itself, is that kind of connective tendon or tissue.
Yes, I mean I suppose it's more to do with Lacan's notion of the real, which is that which is outside the symbolic order, that which cannot be symbolized, that which is or at least it occupies a kind of liminal relationship with language. So it's only in a way thinkable through language, but at the same time it's kind of outside it. It's kind of beyond its limits. So it refers to some notion of the void, if you like, of kind of emptiness, which cannot be represented. And of course in Lacan's sort of psychology or psychoanalytic theory, it's it refers to this kind of original sort of jouissance that the subject experiences, with the mother, which later gets kind of, as it were, shut out from the symbolic order. But I think there is a connection, isn't there, between that notion of the real and Stirner's idea that the egoist is ultimately grounded upon this sort of indefinable nothingness, which is to some degree outside of language and even outside of thought itself, paradoxically. I mean, he actually, at one point towards the end of the book, he talks about this idea of thoughtlessness, in other words, of a certain kind of, not so much an experience, but a certain void which is beyond conceptual structures, which is to some degree unthinkable, but at the same time is the very basis of our own sort of subjectivity. So perhaps it refers to a certain sort of ontological anarchism, whereby meaning itself, or fixed meanings, fixed representations, become destabilized, or perhaps, as it were, grounded upon a kind of an anarchic void, which destabilizes their identity. So yes, we can think of something which is beyond representation or beyond symbolization, which at the same time becomes the very basis for our attempts to construct meaning. Perhaps it's a rather sort of tenuous link, but I think there is a kind of a parallel there, right? I mean, there's something.
Oh, absolutely.
There is some kind of common ground there, I would say.
I definitely think so. You describe the self as here in the book as kind of an empty, undefined, and contingent thing, a process, right. A continuous flow of self-creating flux.
Yes.
Not to get us off topic too much, but my immediate thought, even though obviously I'm not the expert, but it reminded me a bit of the body without organs, and I don't know if I'm reading too much into that or or not.
That's a concept which I've struggled to understand, really. Actually, which I just
that's hilarious.
They were just making this stuff up, weren't they? Around doing drugs and the body without organs. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
Sounds good. Well, write that down.
It's experimental philosophy. Yes. Yes. I mean, to the degree to which I do have, the degree to which I do understand. I mean, it's once would refer to once again to some notion of a kind of of contingency, or of becoming something which cannot be sort of put into fixed borders or boundaries. So, yeah, that's about all I got on that one.
Brief off topic. Well, it's sort of on topic. Are you familiar with the Deleuze memes of? Can you kind of? It's an angry tone, and it's explain Deleuze to me. Don't dumb it down, and all.
Right, no, I haven't seen that one.
I'll have to send it to you. So it's a pretty popular one.
Right.
They get circulated quite a bit. So we already went into the creative nothing and its relation to Lacan, and I think now if I'm ready to perhaps jump into Lacan, and I'm kind of curious before we do is just kind of get, because personally Lacan, I think even though he's kind of a bastard, I can't help but there's something about him that's alluring.
Sure.
I don't know what it is. It's sort of, I don't know. He's just, he has an aura. He has stage presence. You know what I mean?
Yes. No, you're right. Very enigmatic character, of course. But I mean, look, his thing has had a huge influence on, my own thinking. I sometimes find it quite difficult to actually think without Lacan, actually. And without the influence of psychoanalytic theory. So yeah, I mean, there's. I mean, yes. I mean, I think he has sort of shaped my political theory in a lot of ways.
It's definitely it's counterintuitive, I think, for anarchism and psychoanalysis to be a connection. So, but I haven't really. It's only been the last maybe 2 years that I've had any exposure to psychoanalysis, and now that's all I can think about almost.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually written about anarchism and psychoanalysis actually in a couple of pieces. I mean, I think there are some connections there. So, I mean, if you look at Lacan's work on the discourse of the master and the discourse of the hysteric in the university and the analyst, the very complicated theory of the Four Discourses, I think there's a kind of I think that model can sort of be mapped onto the relationship between the revolutionary on the one hand, who'd be the hysteric, and of course Lacan relates revolutionary desire to the hysteric's desire, because the hysteric is always kind of questioning authority and so on. But at the same time, the hysteric is someone who, and indeed the revolutionary, is someone who secretly desires the master. Of course, this was his famous line to the the rebellious students in May 68. He said, revolutionary desire has only one thing, which is the desire for a master. What you really want, he said, is another master. You will get one. And perhaps he was right. And of course, there is that, very, perhaps controversial thesis that, May 68 essentially led to, new kinds of neoliberal structures of power, which are based upon a certain kind of, notion of decentralized agency and so on. So all revolutionary desire gets co-opted or sort of reincorporated into new structures of power, new structures of authority, whether they're sort of hierarchical or sort of flattened out, networked, decentralized. So we need to somehow break with this dialectic once again, don't we, between revolutionary desire on the one hand and the master who is pulled down by the revolutionary, but only to kind of create a new position of mastery in its place. So how do we do this? And this is where the discourse of the analyst comes in. The analyst is sort of a circuit breaker between that, between the hysteric and the master. And the analyst is someone who invites us to, as Lacan puts it, traverse the fundamental fantasy of revolutionary desire. In other words, to kind of get over this idea that somehow the object of your desire lies on the other side of power. That in other words, the thing which is the narrative is the thing which is preventing you from realizing your desire or from attaining the object of your desire. It's that thing that we call power or authority or the state or the law. And if only we kind of break through that barrier, then we'll be happy, we'll be fulfilled, we'll be free, we'll live in a fully liberated society. This is the fantasy of all revolutions, isn't it? That somehow everything will be resolved once a revolution happens. And it's been proven to be untrue time and time again. All revolutions create their own problems, their own new systems of power. So we have to develop a different kind of, I guess, position in relation to power, actually, which is not strictly the one of the position of the revolutionary, perhaps the position of the insurrectionist. Maybe we somehow need to, reconfigure power relations, or somehow, reconstitute it on the basis of ourselves. What does that mean? What am I trying to say? It goes back, I think, once again to the notion of the egoist. I mean, the egoist is someone who determines his or her own reality in a sort of completely autonomous way. And I suppose I'll take the kind of the Foucauldian position. You're never actually going to overcome power altogether. There's always going to be power in any kind of society, whether those power relations are sort of hierarchical or perhaps more sort of egalitarian and reciprocal, but perhaps we just have to reconcile ourselves with the fact that there will be at some level power relations. And what this perhaps calls for is a sort of ongoing ethical critique of power, which in a way never really ends, right? An ongoing sort of ethical interrogation of power without perhaps the illusion that, you can be sort of completely free or completely liberated or have a society which is completely without power relations. So I think that's what I take from Lacan in relation to radical politics. I mean, on one reading, I suppose you could say that Lacan is quite conservative in a way, because he's basically warning all revolutionaries that it's all going to end in disaster, and it's going to end up in a new discourse of mastery. But on the other hand, I think it's quite a worthwhile sort of cautionary tale, if you like, to revolutionaries, to really kind of think about what you're doing and to kind of invent new forms of politics. And maybe the old model of revolution, whereby we simply imagine that we can destroy the state or destroy capitalism as in one sort of grand event, is something which just doesn't really work anymore. Perhaps it never really worked. Maybe the goal is to kind of invent new micro political relations between people, rather than to even in the current moment, right? So rather than sort of waiting for the great revolutionary event at the end of history, we invent kind of micro political, micro ethical insurrections in the present moment. I mean, this is also very much to do with anarchism's idea of prefiguration. We have to kind of, in a way, invent the revolution in the present moment. We have to live as if we're already free,
right?
Even within very confined spaces, even within institutions, for instance, even within the oppressions of current society, we simply have to sort of carve out little spaces of freedom and autonomy and so on, where relations between individuals can be different, can be more reciprocal, more self-determining, and more autonomous.
So you mentioned kind of the patrician sort of essence of Lacan. I've had a joke that, and this is through kind of like the idea of I think like Nick Land has the idea of templexity, where the future causes the past. So I have this joke about Plato got his whole idea for the philosopher king from Lacan. He somehow that was his vision, was Lacan in his fur coat with his smashed up cigar.
With a crumbling cigar, yeah.
Exactly. This is getting a bit off topic, but I'm curious. You mentioned, at least in the From Bakunin to Lacan book, that Deleuze and Guattari's notion of desire there's a metaphysical aspect to it and I'm curious how you see Lacan's, or if you still see Lacan's as in opposition to that, or how Lacan avoids a metaphysical desire.
I suppose perhaps on a more superficial reading, you could say that the idea of desire is I suppose because it's so sort of prevalent, and it's so, as it were, to all encompassing, is that which, as it were, derives subjectivity, for instance. It is kind of a metaphysical concept, and of course, Deleuze's Deleuze and Guattari's famous critique of psychoanalysis is that desire is based on lack. So and they wanted to kind of create a new understanding of desire, which is kind of sort of about plenitude, about excess. So it's not based on sort of lack, emptiness. Doesn't go back to the lack of the mother, the lack of the object of desire, for instance, as in sort of classical psychoanalysis. But on the contrary, it's something which is self-constituting, self-creating. It's something which kind of exceeds rather than exceeds borders and boundaries, rather than something which is kind of a hole or an emptiness. I think the most you have in mind, Freud and Wilhelm Reich, I think, when they're talking about or criticizing the notion of, or the psychoanalytic notion of desire as lack. I think Lacan's idea of desire is probably more interesting, perhaps less metaphysical, in the sense that even though it is based on lack, I think he kind of later became more interested in the drives and in sort of jouissance. So there was kind of he kind of moved away from the kind of the centrality of desire, and the point about the drives is that they're kind of they're multiple, they're plural, they're not sort of one concept, but they're many. So I don't think it's something which can be sort of universalized into one kind of single entity in that way. And maybe in a way you could say that Lacan does move slightly closer to Deleuze in the end, actually. Where
definitely, yeah.
Somehow which is sort of multiple rather than a sort of a single unified entity.
I have heard it argued that, I guess, in the later Lacan, after the publication of Anti-Oedipus, that that's when Lacan really starts to get weird, is right around Seminar 20 or so.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
And I think maybe that's also his importance, is he's kind of the first thinker to get into this really weird terrain that Deleuze and Guattari, pick up and sort of run with that. But I also don't think that necessarily, so even though Lacan's desire is predicated on lack, I mean, you talk very much so that lack, that is kind of, I think that lack is obviously, that's productive as well. Like that can still map onto this, this very positive or creative force, perhaps, in desire that Deleuze and Guattari were trying to focus on. And in the book, you discuss a little bit of this kind of tie between this sort of, and maybe this is more so with the real than desire specifically, but that the space that this gives us for an outside, something beyond identity.
Right. It's the outside, which is also on the inside. This is the paradox of the
Klein bottle, or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Those sort of topological structures that Lacan experiments with, where you start on one side of the what do you call it? The kind of the
Ouroboros,
with inside out, exactly, and you sort of end up on the inside. So, so in a way, it kind of deconstructs the whole inside outside sort of binary, doesn't it? So, I suppose what Lacan would say is that even though the real is outside of language and outside of symbolization, it's that which cannot be represented. At the same time, it's only thinkable, or we can only approach it through language and through symbolization. Otherwise, it's simply without meaning as such. It simply doesn't exist. So it's this kind of liminal space, which is neither sort of strictly outside nor strictly inside, but sort of something of both. What do we do with that notion? Well, can we think about subjectivity in those terms as well, actually? Can we think about ourselves in that sort of liminal space?
You made it.
What do we want to?
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
That'll be the point.
That's what I desire. Yes.
That's right. Yes, that's right. But maybe that's the inevitable structure of subjectivity, isn't it? That's certainly what Lacan would say, that we spend our whole life trying to make sense of ourselves. We spend our life trying to fit in with a symbolic order. Who am I? What's my identity? But it never quite works. There's always some aspect of ourselves which kind of doesn't quite fit in, which kind of slips out from the structures, right? But it's that which escapes symbolization, which Lacan would say is that which also at the same time propels desire. I mean, in other words, if we knew exactly who we are and what we wanted, and what our subjectivity meant, what our identity was, then we would just stop desiring. That'd be it. That'd be a bit like death, I suppose. I mean, death being the ultimate reconciliation of subjectivity. So the fact that we sort of keep on desiring is precisely because there's an element of ourselves which doesn't quite fit. And in a way, once again, Stirner was onto the same thing. I mean, he talked about this figure of the unman being the other of man. So we have this kind of humanist figure of man, which kind of comes from Feuerbach, this kind of anthropomorphic, anthropocentric idea, man being modelled on God, man being this kind of man becomes a sort of ideal of morality, of rationality. And
becomes an obligation, I think, too, right?
It becomes an obligation, a religious obligation, actually. But Stirner says that we try to conform to this moral ideal of man, of what it means to be human. We try to conform to this essence, or we try to sort of seek this essence inside of ourselves. But there's always this little part which kind of falls outside of it, which escapes it, and it's that part which escapes it, which is interesting for Stirner. It's a sign that we are singularities. We simply cannot be encompassed within these universal structures of meaning. It doesn't work.
That has a lot of resonance now, I think, in terms of the protests as well. as far as what makes, what's a protester and what's the moral type of protest is all, non-violent protest is the moral thing, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, that's, and you can see also how power kind of tries to play that game, so that we know, Trump says, well, it's not the peaceful protesters, it's these, these sort of anarchist disruptors who are going to come from the outside just to stir shit up. That's a game that power tries to play. It kind of divides the peaceful protesters from the troublemakers. But yes, I mean, there is that kind of attempt to say, those who engage in peaceful protests, they're doing the right thing. It's those who engage in certain acts of violence or property destruction, for instance, they're the malignant, destructive force, which we need to separate from the peaceful movement.
Which really goes to, I think, the distinction between morals and ethics.
Yeah.
Right. Because
right.
The moral thing is, don't damage property, but the ethical thing, the ethics of it are, yes, absolutely, in a sense.
Well, I can damage property all level, so as long as I don't damage my property, I'm quite happy, really.
Oh, that's good.
No, absolutely. I mean, to the extent to which there is a distinction between morality and ethics, ethics is something which is, in a way, up to autonomous individuals to kind of determine. So it's not to say that, it's not to say that people don't live by an ethical code, but it's also an ethical code which has to be to some degree shaped by the individual. It's not the same as nihilism or complete relativism. Foucault was someone who's interested in, when he's looking at the sort of the ethical cultures of the self in antiquity, he was looking at the ways in which, prior to early Christianity, different cultures developed their own, or individuals within those cultures developed their own sort of moral, their own ethical codes, I should say, which were quite rigorous. And they were really based upon, how one should live, how one should interact with others, referred to everything from, diet and exercise to sexual relations. And for Foucault, it was also a political question. So, he was interested in the way in which, for instance, in ancient Greek philosophy, if you didn't have sort of some degree of ethical self-mastery or ethical control over your own desires, if you like, then you had no control over how you would relate to other people. If you read Plato, the tyrant is always a kind of very unstable character who simply has no mastery over himself, over his own lusts, his own desires. So I think that's the other thing I would say about ethics. Ethics is something which kind of starts from oneself and one's own ability to exercise a degree of power and a degree of mastery over oneself and one's own desires. And Stirner was interested in this notion too. The egoist is someone who can master his or her own desires, drives, inclinations, and so on. So, contrary to what many critics of Stirner would say, Stirner is someone who's I think deeply engaged and interested in ethical questions, but not the ethics which kind of call the morality, which kind of comes from from Christianity and from idealism, which kind of gets universalized into new kinds of idols, but rather an ethics which kind of flows from the self.
Would you consider that a materialist ethics?
Certainly not an idealist ethics.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
I think, I don't know, it depends what you mean by materialism, I suppose. I don't think Stirner's a materialist, certainly on the sense that Marx was.
Right.
In fact, I think
in a broader context, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think you'd probably see idealism and materialism as, but we see materialism as almost like the flip side of idealism. So the problem with materialism and this kind of idea that within material relations is this sort of immanence. I think you would regard as another kind of theological notion, another sort of inward spirit, which kind of and as we know from Marx, of course, the motor of historical materialism is sort of the dialectic and the movement of history. So there is this kind of spirit central to Marx's historical materialism. But yeah, I really think Stirner's onto something which is completely different. Actually, it's about singularities first and foremost, not pluralities, but singularities, and the singularities are kind of self-defining, constitutively open entities which have no sort of fixed borders or boundaries, which are sort of constantly kind of constituting and reconstituting themselves. Perhaps you could say it's sort of close to Deleuze's notion of becoming, if that's kind of a materialist ontology, but that's about as close as it would come, I would say.
Okay. You make an interesting argument that, at least in this book, that post-structuralism doesn't really account or allow for there to be an outside to power and discourse, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yes.
In the sense of, because you kind of also say that Lacan is going beyond the post-structuralist in this way and having that lack, or the Lacanian real perhaps being that the crack that can allow us to conceive of a new freedom.
Yes, maybe. I mean, it's funny. I mean, I wrote that thing such a long time.
I know, right?
I don't remember what the hell I was actually talking
Putting
about.
your memory to the test today.
just trying to sort of make sense of confused morass of my own ideas back then.
It's good though, because what I think is really interesting here is you typically kind of see Lacan as this sort of strange bridge or connection point between structuralism and post-structuralism. So I thought it was very interesting that you were saying he even has an openness that even Deleuze and Guattari sort of don't really have the ability to capture. Yeah.
And it might be that perhaps I've slightly changed my view of my post-structuralism since then. I'm not sure I would say now that Lacan, this really goes beyond post-structuralism. I mean, post-structuralism is a funny kind of catch-all. It's a bit like postmodernism in ways, isn't it? It's a funny sort of catch-all category. Most of the key post-structuralist thinkers wouldn't even know what it meant, or they would probably they would have refuted the term. I mean, you have a kind of a post-structuralism a la Daredev, which is very much focused on language. Is there an outside of language for Derrida? No, probably not. But I mean, in a way, language always kind of destabilizes itself, right? I mean, language or the structures of language always kind of trip up over aporias, over slips of the tongue, accidents of speech, contradictory concepts. What he calls, supplement, for instance, the way in which one linguistic concept will depend upon another, which at the same time kind of pulls it down and undermines it. For Foucault, yes, I mean, power is obviously a very central concept. On a superficial reading, you might say that there's no outside to power, but I mean, in a way, there is. At sort of the edges or the limits of power relations, there are acts of resistance, for instance, which to some extent exceed power relations, even if power relations get sort of reconstituted later. So I would say that with Lacan, I mean, the real is that which kind of exceeds language and symbolization. But once again, it's in a sort of liminal zone, isn't it? Which is both within and outside of language. So I think looking back, I'd probably put perhaps reasons for simplicity. I just put Lacan back in with a post-structure, just of a different kind of a different stripe, different kind. Focused on different kinds of questions, different philosophical questions, and so on. And perhaps there isn't all that much to be gained by somehow seeing Lacan as being a bit of a sort of an outlier or something.
You do mention a bit about the I think it's in the Écrit is the de Sade and Kant piece about the law, and I don't know, I think that feels very relevant to our current moment as well, and sort of how the law sort of constitutes itself is something that I think both, well, really Stirner in particular, really understands in a very sophisticated way.
Well, you mean the law of desire? I mean, Lacan's argument basically is that de Sade is the other side of Kant. So Kant tries to erect a kind of a system of law, but he's impelled by a certain kind of desire for the law, whereas decided in the same sort of ways engaged in sort of a Kantian project, trying to found the law of perversity, if you like, on the basis of desire. So I mean, certainly for Lacan anyway, I mean, the law and desire are kind of almost like two sides of the same coin, right? I mean, so, the illusion of desire or the illusion of the object of desire is that which is on the other side of the law. And in a way that law being the barrier between, the subject and that which he desires, is at the same time the thing which constitutes the illusion of desire. In other words, you only really think you want something because there's some barrier that stands in the way of your desire, and that barrier, in classical psychoanalytic terms, is the father. The father's no, the father's prohibition, the father who says, no, you can't sleep with your mummy, you can't desire your mummy. So in the classic sort of Oedipal narrative, obviously, the Oedipal desire is sort of constituted through the father's prohibition, right? But at the same time, it's kind of an illusory construct created by the law. I mean, it makes perfect sense, I think, to think about it in those terms, right? I mean, it's you don't desire things in and of themselves. You desire things because someone says no to you. Someone says, no, you can't have it.
Right. It's that contradiction in Lacan that I just find fascinating. Often they're sort of against the grain, or against sort of this rationalist viewpoint that we're often instructed upon, that is, everything makes sense, and like you said earlier, that we're rational actors, and
yes
using information and so forth.
But there's nothing rational about human desire. Gosh.
Absolutely.
I mean, Lacan would say animals in a way much more rational than human beings are, because animals are kind of utility maximized. I mean, whatever an animal does is entirely rational. It's geared towards its own survival, whereas we human beings, for the most part, do things which are entirely sort of self-destructive, go against our own rational self-interest, and all ways. We're not utility maximizing at all. We're driven by by unconscious desires, which weird sort of fantasies, and we believe we want something when we don't, and that's the magic, if you like, of human desire. Is it ultimately goes against our rational self-interest.
Right.
What makes us interesting?
The assumption that we can really truly understand or know our desire, but it's always denied to us. I guess is that kind of what the Bard subject is getting at in a sense? Well, I guess you actually described it earlier. It's like only because there's you're prohibited do you desire.
Yeah, but it's even more complicated actually. In a way, the anxiety is created when the object of desire comes too close, right? Why is that the case? Because we know that if we actually get what we want, that's the end of our desire altogether. And one thing that desire wants is to keep on desiring, right? So in other words, if you think about it like if you get what you want, you don't want it anymore. You always want something else. That's the nature of desire, right? You think that somehow your desires are going to be fulfilled if you have this great relationship, or this great house, or make money, or whatever, or get that job you've always wanted. But actually, when you get those things, you actually realize it's not that great. I didn't really want this in the first place. Want something else, and so desire wants to keep on desiring. So when the object of desire comes too close, what do? We erect imaginary barriers in the way of that object of desire, so that we almost have an excuse to say, well, I could have got that, but if it wasn't for this thing which stands in my way.
Okay.
Going back to revolution and political desire, it's the same with revolutions, right? So in a way, the revolutionary, as a kind of a hysteric, has an interest in fetishizing power or fetishizing the state, you see, because it kind of operates as a kind of an excuse. So the revolutionary can say, well, I could be free if only it were not for the structure of power that kind of stands in the way of my desire, that prohibits me,
right? Okay,
represses me, or oppresses me, for instance, right? So I think in a way, the law is created through desire. We desire the law precisely because the law operates as a kind of the law is that which once again allows us to kind of as it were, to avoid or to escape a confrontation with our own desire.
You had a very interesting.
It's yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, does that make sense?
Yes. No, absolutely. You had a really interesting discussion here too, and I think you kind of hit on this quite a bit, but I just thought it was something to highlight here is this the idea of the place of power and its ties to the Lacanian real, and like you discussed, that sort of the real of that antagonism that can never be overcome or suppressed, and how that will sort of you squash the real here, it's going to pop up elsewhere.
Right. Yes.
And I think that applies very well, like you said, to revolutions, right? You think that we try to press it up, but it will just manifest itself in a different form.
Yes. Okay. Indeed. Yes. Yes. No. The real is that which is basically irrepressible, right? I mean, it is the structure of, I don't know, the sort of human experience and human desire, right? So you think you've attained the object of desire, and yes, you haven't. It always eludes you. So the outside is that which which is irreducible, you could say.
In this context, is there a place of resistance that we can occupy at all?
It's a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, I think there is no, in the Lacan book, I talk about the uncontaminated place of power. In other words, the fantasy of revolutions is that there's this kind of, as it were, morally pure position for the revolutionary to take, that's somehow outside of power relations, and I don't think there is actually. I think there's contingent spaces of resistance which exist within power relations, and I think those give us an opportunity to actually reconstitute, reconfigure power relations in ways which are more sort of egalitarian, more fluid, more free. But can you ever sort of get outside of power completely? I'm not sure, actually. I'm very skeptical about this notion of a completely liberated society. Maybe we can only speak about, what Hackenbay referred to as, temporary autonomous zones. Little sort of moments and spaces of insurrection. I mean, I think what's happening in the United States is a kind of a autonomous zone, or a temporary autonomous zone, for instance. Spaces of resistance, of confrontation, where people also have an opportunity to kind of invent for themselves different kinds of relations, not only with power but also with one another. And we also find other examples of this. I thought Occupy for all its faults was quite an interesting experiment in creating autonomous forms of politics, even if it was totally got bogged down by sort of procedure and silly sort of hand gestures and that kind of thing. I mean, it nevertheless was an interesting experiment in an attempt to kind of create a new kind of sort of public space, but it wasn't a permanent space, and perhaps it couldn't have been. So these experiments, I think, are always interesting and valid and worthwhile. But I don't think you're ever going to find yourself in this sort of completely sort of liberated or permanently liberated space. I think there's always going to be this kind of antagonism or this sort of contestation with power.
I think that wraps up our kind of Lacan discussion. Just had a couple of closing questions I wanted to get your opinion on. One was, I wanted to know if you had a point of view on accelerationism, or kind of the work of the CCRU, because I feel like I think you do have an earnest approach to examining kind of what our situation is when it comes to power and what our options are, that I think is somewhat, at least, in some strains of accelerationism is also present, right? Sort of recognizing these quaint, 20th century notions of revolution are simply, that the time is sort of past for those methods, and we've got to come up with something new or a new approach or new tactics, etc.
Yes, but I'm not sure I would necessarily equate that with accelerationism. I mean, the CCR, that's sort of Nick Land's old outfit at work.
Right.
And, what's Nick Land doing these days? He's basically
Yeah.
a neo-fascist
Right.
track, isn't he?
Yeah.
And maybe that's where accelerationism, gets you to or leads you to. I mean, what's the idea of accelerationism? You put everything about capitalism into overdrive in the perhaps the illusory or vain hope that somehow capitalism will kind of fall over itself or collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But maybe all you get is just new and worse forms of capitalism. Destructive, nihilistic, destructive of the natural environment, for instance. I'm very skeptical, I have to say, of accelerationist philosophy, actually. And I think Nick Land is a sort of perfect example of the dark side of this seemingly kind of revolutionary discourse.
Right. It's quite sad. His early work, I think, is quite interesting, and he definitely can write.
Yes.
He can write prose, but it is quite sad. I do follow him on Twitter, and yes, he does. He's on about all this gibberish about IQ and
no, absolutely.
trash like that often.
It ends up in this kind of sort of neo-feudalism, doesn't it? Where he's basically affirming new and elite sort of structures of capitalist power, which are whereby the whole, even the very basic notion of kind of liberalism and democracy are being completely removed. I mean, it's capitalism as neo-feudalism. Maybe that's the ultimate outcome of accelerationism.
But what do you think, though, about, I think Mark Fisher perhaps Mark Fisher is more on the sort of left side of that than Land. So I was just kind of curious. I think, obviously everyone associates Land with accelerationism, but there are, there's so many different subtypes. I think even there's anarcho-accelerationism, and there's xeno and gender and unconditional. And
there's something, I don't know what it is, but there's something I find a little bit scary about accelerationism, actually. I mean, it's what is it? I mean, it's completely... It's totally destructive and nihilistic in a way, isn't it? Right? It really is sort of taking Marx's thesis about how capitalism is, in a sense, liquefies everything, turns everything, it's constantly sort of reconstitutes all existing sort of social relations. But I mean, what is that? Where's the natural environment in this? I mean, where are certain things which should be conserved and preserved and protected? Right. I mean, doesn't accelerationism lead to the complete and utter, rapid industrialization or hyper-industrialization of everything? Surely there's something about the existing world which should be protected.
Right.
Maybe it should be the basis of our radical politics. Not this whole idea that everything needs to be, revolutionized constantly. I think it's actually a very modernist notion in some ways, isn't it? Isn't it kind of the ultimate trajectory of industrial modernity?
I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
Final question for you would be, what has anything changed? I think so. I haven't read Political Theology, which is that. Am I correct? That is the most recent book.
It is. Correct. Yes, that's right.
I haven't gotten around to that one yet, so I was kind of curious. Since you kind of Post Anarchism was published in 2015, right? Or
2016, I think.
2016. Actually. So I feel like there's a distinction. I'm curious what you would have written if you had waited perhaps another year, and kind of where you kind of see things falling now. That definitely there's been an inflection point in terms of the motors of history turning again.
Well, certainly. I mean, so I was writing Post Anarchism, I suppose, around the time of, or perhaps just after, the Occupy movements and movements of the public squares in Greece, the insurrections, that had taken place in the Middle East and the Arab Spring, and I thought, this was a kind of an anarchist or a post-anarchist moment, and I was quite sort of inspired to take that as my kind of sort of real world starting point in a way. I'm certainly still interested in anarchism and post anarchism and in the political theology book, which is kind of a new, moving to a new area for me. I mean, there's still a lot about anarchism in that book. And in fact, the last chapter is really devoted to kind of ecological anarchism and even certain forms of kind of religious anarchism, which I find quite interesting. So certain sort of way Christian anarchism. Well, has the world changed? I suppose. I mean, if you look at what's going on at the moment, right? I mean, it's with these protests and insurrections that are going on, not just in the United States but around the world. I mean, it's really very interesting, and it's an anarchist moment once again. I mean, the dream of anarchism, or the anarchist impulse, the anarchist insurrectionary impulse never really dies, does it? And whenever there's an abuse of power, people will resist. And I'm so, I'm still kind of very much engaged with what anarchism might mean today as a kind of an ethics and a politics and a way of being in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, I am too. That's why we're here. So
that's why we're here, exactly.
What just before we wrap things totally up, what are you working on at this moment, if you don't mind, if you can share anything and kind of where your horizons are right now?
So, I mean, a number of projects really. I want to do some more work on Etienne de Laboissy and the whole kind of voluntary servitude idea, and how we kind of experience voluntary servitude today in all kinds of ways, in sort of forms of digital surveillance and so on. I mean, I'm writing more about political theology and the relationship between kind of religion and politics and theology and politics, and whether there's any kind of radical implications for sort of within theological thinking. So a number of projects at the moment. Still waiting for the idea of the next sort of book idea, but hasn't quite come yet.
Do you have?
I think it's probably fair to say that all of my thinking kind of in a way gravitates around some form of anarchism. Perhaps this is my
touchstone.
This is my touchstone, exactly. That's right. Yes, my sort of my sort of abstract ideal that I try to sort of follow and kind of reinvent and rearticulate in different ways.
Absolutely, that's I think that's a project we share. Is there anything else that you'd like to say to maybe listeners, or just in general to truly close out the episode?
I'd like to say to all your listeners in the United States, I mean, keep up the struggle. It seems very obvious to me that, that power is crumbling. In fact, power never really existed in the White House in the first place, actually. And I think, like I said, I think it's very, very interesting that, the police power is really being, subjected to such a kind of a sort of a radical critique. I mean, not just within the United States, but globally. So I just want to salute the insurrectionists in the United States, and just say how impressed and how much admiration I have for their courage, for their tenacity, their persistence, and I think some very interesting things can actually come out of this. In fact, I was reading something today about how this is potentially the May '68 moment of the United States once again.
Yeah, exactly. Let's hope the results are different this time.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yes, indeed.
But once again, Saul Newman, tremendous pleasure to have you on the podcast. This was amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your weekend to talk. This was amazing.
No problem at all. I very much enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
And, I look forward to seeing the podcast somewhere on your website.
Sounds fantastic. I'll definitely get that out to you. But once again, this is Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry signing off for the week.
All right.
All right. So enjoy your weekend. Thanks again. It'll probably be another week before I release the episode.
Okay.
I have kind of a backlog. So I'll definitely email you as soon as it's out.
That'd be great.
Thanks again. Tremendous pleasure.
Yes. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Including the ultimate form of singularity, which is podcast. violence without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. And so on and so on. What I meant is the following, please.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.